My name is Elena Ferrero. I am 67 years old. For 32 years, I worked as a notary in Milan, a profession built entirely on the architecture of certainty, deeds, signatures, verifiable facts, legally binding truths. I lived inside the geometry of what could be proven. So when I tell you that a 15-year-old boy whispered something into my ear 1 second before I signed the most consequential document of my life, something he had no possible way of knowing, something that only made sense 26 days later when he was already dead, I need you to understand that I am not a woman given to invention. I have spent my entire life on the opposite side of that. What I am about to share with you does not fit inside any framework I was trained to trust. And yet here I am, 18 years later, unable to explain it any other way. Before I go any further, a lot of people have asked me how they can support this space. So I created a support page. If this channel has meant something to you, it's in the first pinned comment. If it's not your moment, that's okay. Now let me tell you what happened. I was born in Milan in the winter of 1957, the only child of Renato and Giulia Ferrero. My father was a civil engineer who built bridges. My mother was a librarian who believed that every important truth had already been written down somewhere. You just had to know where to look. I inherited something from each of them. My father's appetite for precision. My mother's conviction that meaning was always recoverable if you were patient enough. I studied law at the Università degli Studi di Milano, graduated third in my class, and completed my notarial qualification at 31. I was precise, methodical, occasionally difficult. My colleagues respected me. Some of them were afraid of me. I considered that an acceptable trade. I had one daughter, Alessandra. She was born in 1971 when I was 24 and had no idea yet what love at its most terrifying could feel like. Alessandra was everything I was not. Warm, impulsive, deeply, fervently religious in a way that embarrassed me privately and delighted her entirely. She collected prayer cards. She went to confession every week. She kept a small statue of Our Lady on her nightstand and spoke to it the way I spoke to my calendar, as though it were a reliable appointment that would always keep. I loved her beyond what I could articulate. I also spent a significant portion of her adult life quietly wishing she would grow out of it. She never did. In the autumn of 1997, Alessandra drove to Assisi with a group from her parish. She was 36 years old, 7 months pregnant with her second child, and she had the particular luminous quality that some women carry in those final weeks before everything changes. On the return drive, a truck crossed the center line on a mountain road outside Perugia. Alessandra died at the scene. The baby did not survive. Her daughter Valentina, who was 4 years old at the time, had stayed home with her father. I remember being told at the hospital in Perugia. I remember the exact color of the linoleum floor in the corridor. I remember thinking, with a coldness that I am still ashamed of, that this was what faith led to, that if Alessandra had not been going to Assisi for spiritual reasons, she would have been home, safe, that her God had taken her somewhere beautiful and gotten her killed on the way back. I know how that sounds. I knew how it sounded even then. But grief does terrible things to the architecture of rational people. We use our most sophisticated tools to build the most irrational conclusions, and we call it logic. And we defend it for years because dismantling it would mean admitting how much we are simply, catastrophically afraid. In the years that followed, I watched my relationship with my son-in-law, Marco, deteriorate under the weight of shared loss handled separately. He returned eventually to his hometown of Verona, taking Valentina with him. We tried, at first, Sunday phone calls, visits at Christmas, birthday cards that arrived 3 days late. And then the calls became less frequent. And then Marco remarried. And then the distance became an agreement we had never formally signed, but both seemed to honor. By 2002, I had effectively lost my granddaughter too. I told myself it was better that way, that I had nothing to offer a child, that I was better suited to documents than to people. I continued working. I attended Mass approximately once a month at the Parroquia de Santa Maria Sagrada, a beautiful and modest church not far from my office on Via Manzoni. I went not because I believed anything that was said there, but because my mother had gone there, and because sitting inside a space that smelled of old stone and candle smoke gave me something that I refused to call comfort, but that functioned essentially as comfort. I was scrupulously honest with myself about the hypocrisy. It didn't stop me from going. It was at Santa Maria Sagrada in the spring of 2006 that I first noticed Carlo Acutis. He was impossible to miss, not because he was dramatic or attention-seeking, quite the opposite, but because he was so thoroughly himself in a context where most people perform a version of themselves they think is appropriate. He wore Nike sneakers, blue, visibly used. He wore jeans. He carried a silver Toshiba laptop in a backpack that also contained, as I would later learn, a bag of kibble for whatever stray cats he encountered on the way. He sat in the fourth pew from the front every morning before school, with the concentrated stillness of someone who had somewhere specific to be that did not involve going anywhere. He was 15 years old, and he received communion with the gravity of a man who understood exactly what he was doing and why. The first time we spoke was a Tuesday in late April. I had stayed after Mass to review a set of documents before heading to the office, and I had spread them across the back pew in a way that apparently made me look like a lawyer. Carlo appeared at my elbow with the directness that was characteristic of him and asked if I was one. I told him I was a notary. He nodded as though this confirmed something he had already suspected, and then he told me about his project. He was cataloging Eucharistic miracles, documented, historically verifiable cases where the consecrated host had exhibited scientifically inexplicable properties. He had been doing it for 2 years. He had visited sites across Italy and was building a digital exhibition, photographs and source documentation, that he intended to make available to anyone in the world with an internet connection. He needed help, he said, understanding how to verify historical, ecclesiastical documents, how to distinguish between primary and secondary sources, how to understand what made evidence legally credible versus merely compelling. I looked at this boy, his dark hair slightly disarranged, his expression completely unself-conscious, his sneaker untied on the left foot, and I felt something that I can only describe as being recognized by something you were not expecting to encounter. I told him I would help him. We met 4 more times over the following months, always at the church or nearby, always for an hour or so before he had to be somewhere. He showed me his website in progress, It was meticulous. It was extraordinary, actually. The organization, the cross-referencing, the precision of his sourcing. I told him so, and he smiled with the particular satisfaction of someone who is working on something they believe matters. What I noticed most about Carlo was not his piety, though that was unmistakable. It was his consistency. He was the same person in every room. He did not become more reverent in church and more casual outside it. He did not perform humility when adults were watching and abandon it when they weren't. He was entirely, seamlessly himself everywhere. Curious, warm, direct, occasionally funny, in the dry, understated way that Milanese people tend to be when they are being funny on purpose. He talked about his faith the way other people talked about a relationship they were genuinely in, not as an obligation, not as an identity marker, as something alive, present, ongoing. By summer of 2006, I noticed he was thinner. I did not ask. It was not my place, and he did not volunteer it. And I was not yet the kind of person who asked the questions that needed asking. In September of that year, I made my decision about the Villa Serena. The villa was a property I had inherited from my parents. A large stone house with gardens, set on the outskirts of Milan near Pero. I had grown up spending summers there. Alessandra had grown up spending summers there. Every room in that house contained a layer of her handwriting in the margins of books, her painted wooden rosary hanging from the garden gate hook, her St. Francis of Assisi medal tucked behind a loose stone in the kitchen wall, where she had placed it at 12 years old, and I had never removed. The house had been empty for 2 years. I had been unable to decide what to do with it, and unable to enter it comfortably, which is a very specific kind of imprisonment. I made contact that autumn with a secular foundation called Fondazione Progresso Laico, which ran vocational training programs for disadvantaged young people across Lombardy. Their director, a capable woman named Marta Colombo, proposed that if I donated the Villa Serena to the foundation, they would convert it into a workshop and training center. Modern, practical, completely repurposed. No religious affiliation, no connection to the past the house represented. It would become something useful, they said, something forward-looking. I told myself I was doing something generous. I was. But I was also doing something deliberate. I wanted that house emptied of Alessandra's faith, the way you might scrub a wound. Not because you hate the wound, but because you cannot bear to keep looking at it. I wanted her rosary taken down from the gate. I wanted her medal replaced by something neutral. I wanted God, specifically, to be removed from the premises, because I had decided that God had not honored his end of whatever arrangement my daughter had believed they had, and I was not willing to let his furniture remain in her rooms. The donation was scheduled for the 28th of September, 2006, 4:30 in the afternoon. Studio Notarile Marchetti, Via Manzoni. I had reviewed the documents 4 times. Every clause was correct. When I walked into the waiting room of the notarial studio that afternoon, Carlo Acutis was sitting in a leather chair by the window. He was visibly unwell. Not dramatically, not in a way that would have alarmed a stranger, but I had seen him regularly for 5 months, and I knew the difference. His face had a particular quality. I can only call it transparency, though that is not exactly right. He was thinner than when I had last seen him 2 weeks before. His eyes were the same as always, dark, present, attentive. He told me he had been accompanying his mother to a notarial appointment in the building next door and had seen my name in the entry register downstairs. He asked quietly if I was there to sign something important. I told him yes, a property donation. He nodded slowly. He looked at me for a moment in a way that I found, at the time, slightly unsettling. Not because it was intrusive, but because it was careful. The way someone looks at you when they are deciding how much to say. The notary called my name. I stood. I picked up my bag. I walked to the office door and put my hand on the handle. Carlo's hand landed on my right shoulder. He leaned close to my ear, and he said, with a quietness and a clarity that I have replayed thousands of times in 18 years. Signora Elena, your name on that paper will cost you everything you have. In exactly 26 days, you will understand. I will no longer be here, but you will know that this is true. I turned to look at him. He did not look frightened. He did not look like someone delivering a warning from a horror film. He looked like someone who was telling me something he was sorry to have to say, but certain was necessary. I asked him what he meant. He said, "Losing everything is the only way to find the only thing." I removed his hand from my shoulder, gently, because I genuinely liked this boy, and because I did not want to be unkind to him. I thought, he is 15, he is unwell, he is deeply religious, he has frightened himself with mystical thinking. I thought, this is what excessive piety does to a bright mind. I thought, I have documents to sign. I went inside. I signed. Elena Beatriz Ferrero, identity document 12.447.392, signature authenticated before notary Luciana Marchetti, 28th of September 2006, 4:47 in the afternoon. The Villa Serena no longer belonged to me. Before I continue, I want to pause here for just a second. Many of you have written asking how to keep this mission alive. There's a support page in the first pinned comment, only if something here has genuinely moved you. If not, I understand. What matters is that you're still listening. 14 days later, on the 12th of October, 2006, Carlo Acutis died. Leukemia, sudden, aggressive, catastrophic. He was 15 years old. He had been diagnosed only weeks before, which explained, I understood immediately, the transparency I had seen in his face. He had offered his suffering for the Pope and for the Church, apparently. His last words, as reported by those who were with him, were about not wasting a single moment that could be given to God. He died in Monza, where he had been taken to hospital, and they buried him in Assisi at his own request, in the sanctuary of the Renunciation, because Assisi was where Francis had stripped himself of everything in order to receive what actually mattered. The funeral at Santa Maria Segreta was attended by hundreds of young people. I sat in the back. I looked at the photograph of Carlo that his family had placed near the altar. His blue sneakers, his backpack, his dark hair, his smile, and I felt something that I did not have words for, which was itself unusual, because I have always had words for things. It was not simply grief, though grief was present. It was the specific disorientation of realizing that someone you knew was larger than you had understood while they were alive. I went home that evening and sat at my kitchen table for a long time. Then I got up and got my calendar. 26 days from the 28th of September. I counted. The 24th of October. I wrote the date in red. I did not tell anyone. I could not have explained it to anyone without sounding like I had been unhinged by the death of a teenager I had known for 5 months. But something in me, irrational, insistent, impossible to silence, had committed to that date the way you commit to a deadline that carries real weight. The days passed with an unusual quality of attention. I noticed things I would normally have moved past. I woke early. I found myself going to Mass not once a week, but twice, then 3 times, then every other day, not because anything had changed in me theologically, but because the church at Santa Maria Segreta was where Carlo had been, and being in spaces where he had been gave me something I could not name. I looked for him irrationally in the 4th pew. The 4th pew was always occupied by someone else now. Of course it was. By the 19th day, I had begun to doubt myself. Nothing had happened. I had lost the villa, but I had intended to lose it. That was not a surprise. I examined my health, normal, my finances, stable, my work, which by this point was limited to part-time consulting, unremarkable. I was sleeping adequately. I was functioning. On the 23rd day, I started to feel something closer to relief. I told myself Carlo had been wrong, not maliciously, not dishonestly, simply wrong in the way that sick teenagers who love God sometimes say things that sound prophetic and are not. I told myself I could let go of the date. I made myself a cup of coffee at 7:15 and stood by the kitchen window, watching pigeons on the ledge of the building across the street, and told myself it was over. On the 24th of October, 2006, at 11:14 in the morning, my phone rang. It was Marta Colombo. Her voice had the careful quality of someone who has rehearsed their opening sentence several times. She said she was calling because something had developed with the Villa Serena that she thought I should know, and she wanted to tell me directly, rather than through formal correspondence. The foundation, she said, had made a decision. The original plan for vocational workshops was still moving forward, but the board had voted 2 weeks prior to expand the scope of the space's use. The villa's residential rooms, which I had not been using, which were simply standing empty, would be converted into a temporary shelter, a refuge for young people in vulnerable situations. Girls primarily, girls who needed somewhere to land. The first resident had arrived that very morning, she said, at 9 o'clock, a 17-year-old from Verona. Her name was Valentina Rossi. I put my hand flat on the kitchen counter. The counter was cold. I focused on that coldness with a precision that I suspect was my nervous system doing what it needed to do to keep me upright. I asked Marta if the girl had mentioned anything about her family. Marta was quiet for a moment. She said, yes. The girl had mentioned that her maternal grandmother was named Elena, but that they had lost contact years ago, and she did not know how to find her. I said, thank you. I will come this afternoon. I put the phone down. I stood very still in my kitchen for approximately 4 minutes. I am certain it was 4 minutes because I was staring at the clock on the microwave and watching the numbers change. Then I sat down at the table and I cried for the first time since the corridor in the Perugia hospital 9 years earlier. Not the controlled, managed grief of a professional woman who has kept it together through necessary things, the other kind, the kind that comes from a place in your body that your intelligence cannot reach. I had signed the donation to erase Alessandra's faith from those walls. I had signed it to remove God from that house. I had signed it to convert something sacred in my daughter's memory into something practical and secular and forward-looking. And in doing so, precisely in doing so, through that specific act and no other, I had created the only possible bridge between myself and the granddaughter I had lost. If I had kept the villa, Valentina would never have gone there. The foundation would not exist there. The shelter would not exist there. If I had not donated, Valentina would be in Verona or somewhere unknown to me, unreachable. If I had listened to Carlo in the literal sense, if I had understood his warning as a reason not to sign, the very thing he was describing would never have happened. He had not warned me to stop me. He had warned me so that when I arrived at the 26th day I would understand, so that I would know, with a specificity that left no room for coincidence, that what had happened was not random, not accidental, not a fortunate alignment of logistics, something that had been seen, something that had been known, something that had been carried quietly by a 15-year-old boy in blue sneakers who went to Mass every morning before school and believed with the complete confidence of someone who actually knew what they were talking about, that the Eucharist was a highway to heaven. I drove to the Villa Serena that afternoon. Marta received me at the door. She had the grace not to ask too many questions. She walked me through the rooms, which had been reconfigured practically, but not unkindly. New beds, simple furniture, a bookshelf being assembled in the front hallway, natural light coming through windows that had been professionally cleaned for what felt like the first time in years. Someone had already placed a small geranium on the kitchen windowsill. Red. Valentina was in the room that had been Alessandra's. I stood in the doorway for a moment before I went in. The room had been painted over in a soft gray. The rosary was gone from the gate, of course. The foundation had cleared the property before taking possession. But the quality of the light in that room was the same. It has always been the same. Afternoon light through that particular window falls at an angle that makes everything in it look like it is in the middle of being remembered. Valentina was sitting on the bed reading. She had her mother's hair, dark brown, long falling forward when she bent her head. She had her mother's posture, that particular way of curling slightly inward when concentrating. She looked up. She did not know who I was. Why would she? She had last seen me when she was 9 years old, at a Christmas that had gone badly in the specific way that Christmas goes badly, when two grieving people try to perform normalcy for a child. I told her my name. I watched her face move through several things in rapid succession. Uncertainty, then something that was almost calculation, then the particular expression people make when a long-held piece of incomplete information suddenly finds its missing part. She said, "Nonna Elena." I said yes. We held each other for a long time. There were no words immediately available, and we did not attempt to supply them. We simply stood in the room that had been her mother's room and held on to each other with the desperate gratitude of people who have both been living with an absence that had the shape of the other person and did not know until that moment that the absence could be filled. I stayed at the villa for 3 hours that afternoon. Marta found reasons to be in other rooms. Valentina and I sat at the kitchen table and talked with the carefulness and the hunger of people who have a great deal of time to account for and do not yet know how. She told me about her father's remarriage, about the years in Verona, about the circumstances that had brought her to Milan and then to a point of acute crisis that I will not detail here, because those details belong to her and not to this story. She told me she had thought about looking for me more than once, but had not known where to begin, and had been afraid I would not want to be found. I want to stop here and tell you that I am a woman who has spent most of her adult life being entirely certain that she knew what was true and what was not. I built my professional identity on that certainty. I reviewed documents with the discipline of someone who understood that a misplaced clause could destroy a family's property rights, a business, a legacy. I was precise. I was careful. I was not susceptible to magical thinking. I cannot explain the letter. 2 weeks after I first went to the Villa Serena, I was helping Marta sort through a donation of books that had arrived for the new library they were building in the former sitting room. The shelf system in the old library, a floor-to-ceiling oak unit that had belonged to my father, had been retained because it was built into the wall and could not be removed without structural work. I was sorting books into categories on the lower shelves, and I reached up to clear some space on the highest shelf, and my hand found a manila envelope tucked flat against the back wall. My name was written on it in handwriting I recognized immediately. I had seen that handwriting on the margin notes of historical documents, on catalog entries for Eucharistic miracles, on the back of a photograph of a host from Lanciano that Carlo had shown me one Tuesday morning in the sacristy of Santa Maria Segreta. Inside the envelope was a single page, handwritten, dated the 15th of September, 2006. 13 days before I signed the donation papers. I am going to tell you what it said, because I have read it so many times that it is now part of whatever I am made of, and I believe you need to hear it. It said, "Dear Signora Elena, you have not yet signed the paper for the Villa Serena, but I know that you will. I also know that within about a month I will no longer be alive. I have leukemia, though no one has told me officially yet. My body knows. I came to visit your villa on Saturday, when you gave me permission to photograph it for my website on Eucharistic miracles. While I was here, the Lord showed me something. I saw a young girl with long brown hair, crying in the room on the second floor. She was your granddaughter, Valentina, and I understood that this place, which you want to donate out of pain, will be the place where the two of you find each other again. You need to lose everything so that God can give you back the only thing that matters. Your signature on that paper is not an ending. It is the beginning of a miracle you cannot yet see. Trust. With affection, Carlo Acutis." The letter was dated the 15th of September, 2006, signed in the same hand, on notepaper from the sacristy of Santa Maria Segreta that I recognized because I had seen it before. I had a professional's instinct for document authentication, and I can tell you with the certainty of someone who has spent 32 years distinguishing the real from the fabricated, that letter was not manufactured after the fact. The ink, the paper, the particular way the R's were formed in the word ricordate, remember, which he used once near the end of a sentence I have not quoted here because it is too personal. the way the margins shifted toward the end of the page, as though he was writing quickly, as though he had something urgent to get to and limited time. Everything about that document said exactly when it was written. He had come to the villa in September to photograph it for his miracle catalog. I had given him the key. I had forgotten entirely that he had visited. He had written that letter, placed it in a manila envelope with my name on it, and put it on the highest shelf of the library in a house that had been locked and empty until the foundation took possession and opened it for the new residents. And in all the weeks that the foundation was renovating, cataloging, transforming, no one had found it, until I reached up to make space for donated books. I sat down on the floor of that library with the letter in my hands. Marta found me there some time later. She did not ask me what was wrong. She sat down next to me on the floor, which was, I thought, an unusually gracious thing for a foundation director to do in the middle of a working Tuesday afternoon, and she waited until I was ready to talk. I told her the basics. She listened. She said very little. At the end, she said, "Do you know what this house feels like now?" I shook my head. She said, "Like somewhere something is supposed to happen." Carlo was beatified on the 10th of October 2020 in Assisi, a Thursday in the Basilica of St. Francis, in the city he loved, in the place where he is buried, in the basilica where Francis of Assisi had once stripped himself of everything his father had given him in order to discover what could not be taken. I was there. Valentina was beside me. She is 35 now. She completed a degree in social work in 2014, the year after she left the Villa Serena Refuge as a resident and began volunteering there in a different capacity. She has been the director of the refuge for 4 years. The foundation kept its name, kept its secular structure, but the Villa Serena has become something that neither I nor Marta could have planned, a place where young women arrive carrying the specific weight of a life that has gone wrong before it properly began, and where they find reliably that the weight can be redistributed among people who are willing to hold part of it. Valentina kept one thing from the original house when she took over as director. She found the St. Francis medal behind the loose stone in the kitchen wall, Alessandra's medal, which she had placed there at 12 years old, which I had never removed, which 39 years of Milanese winters had left intact behind that stone. Valentina had it cleaned and mounted in a small case, and she put it in the entrance hall, just inside the front door, where every new resident sees it when they arrive. She told me once that she tells the girls it belonged to her mother, which is true. She does not usually say more than that. She says it is just a detail, just something from the family. But occasionally, when a girl is having a particularly hard day, Valentina will take it down from the wall and let her hold it and tell her the longer version of the story, the version where a woman signed a paper to destroy something sacred, and in doing so, built a church. I live near the villa now, 5 minutes by foot. I have a small apartment on the 3rd floor of a building, with a view of a courtyard where the neighbors have planted jasmine along the south wall. And in May, which is now, when I open my window in the morning, the smell comes in before I am fully awake. And for a moment, in that particular liminal space between sleep and consciousness, everything I thought I had lost is exactly where it should be. I go to Mass every day. This surprises people who knew me before. It surprises me sometimes to realize how fully I mean it when I am there. Not the performed meaning, not the habitual meaning, but the actual kind, the kind that costs something to sustain. I go because I understand now, at 67, what Carlo understood at 15, that the thing you think you are doing and the thing you are actually doing are very often different things, and that the gap between them is where grace tends to operate. I go because I owe him a kind of attention I did not give him when he was alive. I go because he wrote me a letter before I had done anything to deserve it, and placed it in a house I had locked, and trusted that I would eventually be the kind of person who could find it and understand what it meant. That is a level of confidence in a human being that I find still extraordinary. He saw something in me that I could not have named in September 2006, something that was not yet true, but that he seemed to believe was coming. I think about the word he used, perderlo tutto, lose everything. I spent 26 days afraid of what that meant. My health, my finances, my mind, some catastrophe I could not anticipate. And what it meant was, lose your certainty, lose your controlled grief, lose your architectural conviction that faith was what had killed your daughter instead of a truck on a mountain road. Lose the careful distance you have maintained from the only person who carries the only living part of Alessandra. Lose your pride about what you know and do not know. I had spent 9 years building a version of loss that was neat and logical and assigned correctly. God had failed Alessandra, therefore God was finished. Therefore the villa that held her faith needed to be converted into something rational, and the conversion happened. And the conversion was exactly what God had needed in order to bring Valentina home. I am not a theologian. I am not, even now, someone who would claim to understand the mechanism by which any of this works. I am a notary. I know how to read a document and understand what it actually says rather than what you want it to say. And what that letter says, what those 26 days said, what a 15-year-old boy in blue sneakers said to me in the waiting room of a notarial studio on a September afternoon, is that the thing I thought I was losing was never mine to keep. Valentina was always going to be Valentina. The villa was always going to be what it needed to be. Carlo was always going to know what he knew. All I had to do was sign my name, which I did, for the wrong reasons, at exactly the right moment. If you are watching this and you are in the middle of something you are trying to hold on to very tightly, a way of understanding something that has hurt you, a certainty you have built around a loss, a logical structure that is protecting you from something you cannot yet look at directly, I want to tell you that I understand. I lived there for 9 years, and I was very good at it. And I want to tell you something Carlo told me, without quite saying it. Losing your grip on the thing you are holding is not the same as losing the thing. Sometimes it is the only way to actually receive it. Carlo Acutis was born in London on the 3rd of May, 1991, and died in Monza on the 12th of October, 2006. He was 15 years old. He had been to Mass that morning, as he had been to Mass every morning for years, because he believed that the altar was the place where heaven and earth stood closest together, and he wanted to be in that room as often as possible while he was still able to go. He is buried in Assisi, as he asked, because Assisi was where Francis had understood that emptying your hands was not impoverishment. I visited his tomb for the first time in October 2007, 1 year after his death. I visited it again in 2020 with Valentina for the beatification. I visit it every year now. I kneel and I say what I should have said in that waiting room 18 years ago, which is simply, "You were right. I don't know how. But you were right. Blessed Carlo Acutis. You who saw clearly what was coming and said it quietly and gently, and without drama to a stubborn woman who did not listen. Pray for those of us who sign things without understanding what we are signing. Pray for those of us who build our grief into architecture and live inside it for years without knowing we are doing it. Pray for the ones who have lost the address of someone they love. Pray for the ones who are holding the wrong things so tightly that their hands cannot open for the right ones. Pray for us the way you prayed for everything else, with that practical, specific, entirely personal attention that you gave to every stray cat in Milan, and every historical Eucharistic miracle, and every person you spoke to in a waiting room 1 second before they made a decision they didn't yet understand. Thank you for writing that letter. Thank you for climbing up to the high shelf in my father's library and placing it somewhere I would eventually find it. Thank you for knowing that I would. If you've walked this far with me, you already know what this channel is about. For those who've asked how to support it, the first pinned comment has a page. Go there only if it feels natural. If not, just share this with someone who needs it today. That is the greatest support of all. And if you have experienced something you cannot explain, something that arrived at exactly the wrong moment and turned out to be exactly right, leave it in the comments. I read everyone. You have no idea how many people are waiting to hear that they are not alone in this. God bless you, and thank you, Carlo.